Not sure.
I'm right here.
Okay. Well, good morning to each of you. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome each one of you to this Directors Forum with the United States Trade Representative Susan C. Schwab. Established by an act of Congress in 1968, the Wilson Center is our nation's official living memorial to President Wilson. It was founded to honor and build upon his legacy as a man who bridged the divide between scholarship and public policy. We bring together the thinkers and the doers, the policymakers, scholars, business leaders in the hope and the belief that a frank and open dialogue can lead to better understanding, a cooperation in public policy. I'm delighted to introduce the chairman of our Board of Trustees, who serves with unusual distinction, an appointee of the President, Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, who is with us today. Go right ahead. Ambassador Schwab is exemplary of the bridges between policy and academia that we seek to build. She served, as many of you know, as Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy from 1995 to 2003. After a very distinguished career in the private sector with Motorola and an earlier stint in government under President George H.W. Bush. President George W. Bush nominated Ambassador Schwab in April 2006. Previously, she served as the Deputy USTR with a trade portfolio spanning the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. Whether it's Korea, Peru, Colombia, or the Doha round of WTO talks, Ambassador Schwab is the face of the United States at the negotiating table. Surely it's one of the most important and difficult jobs in the United States government. In the era of globalization, building economic bridges between countries around the world has never been more important. Expanded international trade opens new markets for U.S. goods and services, raising productivity, creating jobs. It's estimated that the United States is $1 trillion richer each year from international trade, and some 12 million U.S. jobs are supported by American exports. It's fitting that the Wilson Center is marking your talk today, Madam Ambassador, with its own modest contribution to the international trade debate. Under the very fine leadership of Dr. Kent Hughes, we are releasing Tools of the Trade, Models for Trade Policy Analysis. It's the product of a conference combining top trade modelers from around the world in the policy community in Washington. May I extend a special thanks to Christine McDaniel with us today, and now the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, to Kent Reinert, an Associate Professor of Public Policy at George Mason, who were the lead editors. Kent Hughes, the director of our stage program here, also contributed to editing the volume and was the host for the two-day conference. Ambassador Schwab received her B.A. in Political Economy from Williams College, her Master's in Development Policy from Stanford, and her Ph.D. in Public Administration and International Business from George Washington University. Ambassador Schwab, we are delighted to have you here. She is going to speak. Because of her schedule, she'll not be able to take questions. She will leave, and as she does so, I will request that you remain in your seats until she has departed the auditorium. Ambassador Schwab, we look forward to your comments.
Lee, thank you very much, Congressman Hamilton. Very, very much appreciated, and congratulations to you and the Woodrow Wilson Center for this event and all that you do. You really do represent the nexus of policy and analysis, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted to see Joe Gildenhorn, the chair of your board, who is a longtime friend of public policy wonks who I got to know when I was Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. So great to see you here, Joe. Let me also express my gratitude and add my congratulations for the solid piece of work that we are talking about and celebrating today to the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, the U.S. International Trade Commission, the Treasury Department, and of course the Wilson Center, pulling all of this together. And also thanks to the USTR Economic Analysis Team. We depend on all of you, as you know, during the course of our negotiations, as we develop priorities and targets in negotiations, as we negotiate, and then when we analyze what we have done for others to pass judgment. Now, I'm speaking today primarily as a user of data and modeling. My wonk instincts will creep in from time to time, but largely think of me as the customer and the teams that we represent, interagency teams, developing, negotiating priorities, negotiating trade agreements, implementing those agreements, representing the United States in international fora, and quite frankly, on the Hill as we articulate what we want to accomplish, what we have accomplished. We need to do that, all of those activities, development of policy, negotiation of agreements, implementation of agreements, based on fact. And these facts, public policy, facts associated with public policy need to be debated thoroughly. And it is critical the work of your organizations and this conference to ensure that we are able to debate many of these issues surrounding trade policy from a common ground. So let me begin with the obvious, and the obvious is y'all have your work cut out for you. The default mode at one point was free trade is good, protectionism is bad. And you know that is not necessarily true today. It was a given, it was the conventional wisdom. It also happens to be true, but it isn't necessarily subscribed to by all in our economy, our political economy. And some question the underlying premises of these elaborate models that you are discussing and debating in the context of your conference and in the papers that have been released. The other thing that makes this particularly challenging is the cycle time for modeling, for collecting data, and for processing that data. Because the cycle time for these set of activities compared to the cycle time needed to address the misunderstanding and misuse of the same data is quite different and creates a particular burden on those of you and those of us who are trying to use data to respond to anecdotes in the course of political discourse and political rhetoric. So this notion of cycle time becomes very, very important because the bad things get out there much more rapidly and much more effectively in some cases than the data that one might use to respond. Hence the importance of this discussion and debate about modeling trade policy and tools of the trade. And again, let me begin with the congratulations. Real progress has been made over the years, in the years that I've been involved in trade policy and negotiations, in estimating the actual impact of trade agreements, particularly tariff changes, on national economies, on states, on regions, and even different income groups. And all you need to do is look at the USTR.gov website or the tradeagreements.gov website, the latter being an interagency effort where we have a lot of information, including state-by-state information, about the impact of pending free trade agreements and previous free trade agreements right down to the state level. That is reflective of the incredible progress that has been made over the years in the analysis of the benefits in terms of the benefits of these trade agreements as reflected in the models. I would note, though, and drawing from your report, that perhaps the biggest challenge that we face when we are engaged in these trade negotiations and using these models today and going forward, the greatest challenges we face relate to insufficient data and arguably the state of modeling techniques that capture the effect, or fully capture the effect, of modern trade agreements involving services, involving investment, involving intellectual property rights protection, and then non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures. You and we also face the challenge of reflecting the growth, namely the dynamic effects, of trade agreements. For example, related to changes in investment and technological innovation, where we know that increased competition can spur firms to innovate and invest more and to introduce products more quickly. But unfortunately, many of the models that are available to us data that we rely on underestimate the real long-term and multiplier effects of the trade agreements that we reach and we implement. The economics and modeling communities need to be committed to advancing on these and other fronts recommended in your papers going forward. And we know we need to work together as policymakers, as analysts, to help you achieve that. Policymakers can help increase the relevance of research by explaining key provisions of agreements, by stressing priorities, by providing data inputs, and by improving data collection. Researchers can help policymakers interpret model results by explaining assumptions that drive the results, by testing the robustness of results, and by being explicit about model limitations. In this regard, we particularly appreciate the rigorous analysis of our free trade agreements, 3 of which are now pending before the United States Congress. Those are the free trade agreements with Colombia, with Panama, and with Korea. Detailed and complex in their characteristics, the evaluation of free trade agreements is the province of a small number of scholars, but your work allows us to negotiate trade agreements that are good, solid agreements that generate economic growth and can lift millions out of poverty. We have challenges that we face together as policymakers, as academics, as researchers, as private sector leaders, and as policy analysts. You look around today and you discover that the forces of economic retrenchment, of isolationism, are on the rise, and the winds of dubious economics and popular myths along with it. We see growing anxiety regarding the effects of globalization at home and across the world. In the face of clear and convincing evidence that opening markets has generated unprecedented economic growth and raised millions of people out of poverty, critics scornfully blame the very engines of growth for every economic hardship. So what do we see here? What we see here is the effects of, first, misuse and or misunderstanding of data. And this is particularly true, and you point this out in your papers, this is particularly true when we get into the issue of causality. What is to blame for what? Listening to the anti-trade rhetoric, you would think that every economic ill in the United States and the world can be attributed to trade. And it occurred to me last week, we were traveling last week, we were in Vegas for the Consumer Electronics Show. We were in Los Angeles where, among other things, we visited with the studios, talked about intellectual property rights, visited with the LA Times. And as we walked out of the LA Times, somebody pointed out to me this huge printing press sitting in the lobby. Well, my guess is in this day and age, fewer people are needed to print the LA Times than were needed at the time that these printing presses were in place. And yet, we had come from the Consumer Electronics Show where you see gadgets that none of us could have imagined 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and I suspect there are a few of you in the audience that actually remember slide rules. Technology changes, and the nature of jobs change. And I would add to these examples of jobs that have been created through innovations that, again, none of us would have imagined decades ago. Thinking, for example, in the services area of express package delivery, UPS, Federal Express, those jobs. Or one of my more amusing anecdotes as a trade negotiator who left trade negotiations and then came back a decade later. In the decade that I was in academia, the United States became an exporter of coffee. How did we become an exporter of coffee? Well, it turns out when we're negotiating trade agreements these days, we check to see what the other country's coffee tariff is. Well, we are both an importer and an exporter of coffee, but you can thank Starbucks and all those Starbucks franchises out there for the fact that we now also export coffee. And you think about jobs created in the context of the production, the processing, the shipping, and of course the retailing, that none of us would have thought of years ago, just a few years ago in that case. The other thing we see reflected in this misuse or misunderstanding of data, unfortunately, is the lack of economics training and basic economic illiteracy in our country and elsewhere. College graduates, and I'm sorry to say even graduates of some international public policy programs, are able to get by without taking a single serious macroeconomics course. Shouldn't be surprising then that many of those don't understand the underlying assumptions of these very sophisticated models that you all are working on. In the case of the former, in case of the economic illiteracy, those of you who are in academia need to be pushing for curriculum changes, curriculum reviews. In the case of the misuse of data attributed to causality, let me suggest that you and we need to do a better and a faster job of explaining trade to normal human beings so that everyone can understand and refute flawed economics. There's also a question of how to ensure that our modeling of trade agreements reflects how business is really conducted, actually conducted in a globalized world. So very much in business modeling has proven hard to reflect in trade modeling. When you think about full product life cycles and supply chains, where a full spectrum of value added is contemplated by those in the private sector, they look at the evolution of a product from ideas to innovation, design, engineering, to manufacturing and assembly, to management and back office activities, whether legal or accounting, to marketing, to distribution, to sales, to after-sales parts and service. If you think of the entire life cycle or supply chain, many of the elements of that are left out of our trade modeling and are left out of a lot of our economic modeling. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that we are not able to capture some of the very fundamental benefits of a dynamic trading system, of a dynamic economy. Services associated with trade, I also mentioned that earlier. I think that is an area where all of us are quite frustrated with our inability to capture in trade agreement models the data that exists and the paucity of data that exists. And the other thing is what companies do to stay competitive, not just in terms of price, but in terms of cycle time. How fast companies move from innovation or have to move from innovation to the marketplace. What decisions they make when they're thinking new product development, quality, customer service, those kinds of behavioral elements that may or may not be easy to build into a model. Your work continues to be essential to show the real and very deep benefits of opening markets and developing a rules-based international trading system. We can and we should debate the range of issues that affect our economy and our economic health as a nation, from education to healthcare to regulatory policy to energy policy and, yes, trade policy. But we also must confront the naysayers with a firm belief in the facts and the power of trade liberalization to unlock economic growth and to combat global poverty. The United States is one of the most open markets in the world, one of the most open economies in the world, and we need to keep it that way. More importantly, we need to open new markets for ourselves and for other nations. That is the basis of our trade liberalization efforts, because a retreat from the world will surely harm rather than help our economic prosperity. And I would note as an aside, knowing that this is not something that you all should or will engage in, But if we ever actually sat down and tried to model some of the rhetoric, some of the naysayers' proposals, I think everyone would be astonished at how ugly the outcomes really would be. Now, here, let's go back to the accusations of those who would advocate walling off our economy and rejecting 7 decades of progressive trade liberalization policies. Let's start with jobs. Many warn that outsourcing and offshoring will ship our jobs abroad, and that our jobs at all levels are vulnerable. You all here today know that job loss and job creation are both key components of a dynamic economy such as we enjoy in the United States. Last year alone, the United States generated a net gain of 1.8 million non-farm jobs, of which 1.5 million were in the private sector. But labor markets change, and across the history of the United States, labor markets have changed to benefit the American people. From farming to manufacturing to services, the American worker has continued to move up the economic ladder with each decade. And today, people change jobs, even careers, many times in the course of their working lives. I'm told that the types of jobs that they now hold reflect the fact that the average American holds 10 jobs before the age of 40. Now, those jobs, those 10 jobs, may well include, or may increasingly include, high-wage, high-skilled jobs in the service sector, or perhaps one of the 5 million jobs that we have insourced through investment from Japanese companies, German or French or Korean firms. You hear from critics that the United States is losing our manufacturing base. In fact, our manufacturing output is up, it's not down. And if you look at the 1987 to 2007 period, the last 20 years, U.S. manufacturing output grew 64%. Now, during that same period, U.S. productivity grew 100%. And unfortunately, U.S. jobs in manufacturing declined by some 20%. But again, go back to questions of causality, productivity enhancement, technological change, and the evolution of technologies and consumer tastes. And those individuals, for those individuals who lost their jobs, it doesn't matter what the macroeconomic data is. Those are individuals who need to be helped. But the key is to help those individuals in a way that doesn't punish the rest of the economy, that really does gain from a vibrant and open economic growth. And whether we're talking about trade adjustment assistance or retraining, we need to be talking most about generating new jobs in the economy and making sure that our citizens are prepared with the education and the flexibility necessary to enjoy and to benefit from those jobs. But again, listening to the rhetoric, you'd think that not only is manufacturing down in the United States, but that employment is down. Even at 5% unemployment, the U.S. economy has generated growth and jobs for an unprecedented 52 consecutive months. Now let's look at our trade deficit, another favorite topic or target. The size and impact of the trade deficit is another popular target of the critics of free and fair trade policy. The trade deficit is indeed something to pay attention to, but only in its proper context. Here again, the issue of causality is relevant. With regard to the source of our trade imbalance, 80% of the increase in last year's goods and services trade deficit resulted from paying higher prices for petroleum imports. Another reason why the trade deficit has remained stubbornly high is that our trade partners have faced a period of relative anemic growth, as the U.S. economy has enjoyed much stronger growth. From 1995 to 2005, for example, U.S. GDP grew at 3.6% a year on average, while Europe, or the Eurozone countries, grew 2.2% a year, and Japan grew roughly at 1.3% a year. I would note that in the first 11 months of 2007, compared to the same period in 2006, our exports grew more than twice as fast as imports. And as a matter of fact, our trade deficit dropped by almost 7%. As a share of GDP, our trade deficit has also declined from 5.8% in 2006 to approximately 5.1% last year. We all know that the best way to rebalance the trade deficit is by increasing our exports to meet increasing demand by our trading partners, and that's exactly what is happening today. And this makes the passage of the pending free trade agreements, whether Colombia, Panama, Korea, that much more important, because the benefits in terms of U.S. exports would be felt immediately. In the case of all three of those agreements and the recently enacted Peru FTA, the vast majority, 80, 90+% of tariffs that are faced by U.S. exporters in these markets would be eliminated the first year and certainly within the first 3 years. And I would note, speaking of economic modeling and results from economic models and modeling, that when you look at U.S. exports to our FTA partner countries, U.S. exports to our FTA partner countries have risen 60% faster than our exports to the rest of the world. And if you look at our most recent free trade agreements, the most recent 10 or so that we've negotiated, U.S. exports have risen almost twice as fast to those countries as to the world as a whole. Let's talk a minute about developing countries. Some argue that developing countries are better off participating in one-way trade preference programs that keep their fledgling industries protected rather than engaging fully in the open global economy. We have reliable studies, many of them generated by folks here in the room, from the World Bank, the Blair Commission on Africa, the IMF among them, that conclude that developing countries are far better off lowering their barriers to trade. Statistics reflecting that developing countries that lowered their barriers to trade grew in the last decade 3 times faster than those that didn't. And the fact that 70% of tariffs paid by developing countries are paid to other developing countries, again, tells us that our efforts in the Doha round to make sure that developed and developing countries alike, particularly the advanced developing countries, each contribute to a successful outcome that is trade liberalizing, that generates new trade flows. The Blair Commission concluded that increasing sub-Saharan Africa's share of global trade by just 1% to 3% would boost incomes in Africa by $80 billion. That surpasses by at least threefold the amount that the region receives from donor countries in official development assistance. And yet we find in the context of the Doha round and FTA negotiations, well-meaning NGOs providing advice to developing countries or political opponents in developing countries that fly in the face of sound economic theory and practice. Clearly, now is not the time to retreat or retrench when it comes to trade. Globalization will continue. It is a fact on the ground. As policymakers, economists, statisticians, political theorists, researchers, academics, and citizens, it is absolutely critical that we accurately model and measure both the positive and the negative impacts of globalization. Only through thoughtful consideration of solid data, however, can we ensure that the benefits of free and fair trade are enjoyed by the broadest number of people and countries. But we will not create a single job in the United States or assist a single villager in a developing country if we relent in our efforts to open new markets. We have a lot to study, to analyze, to debate. We should do that. And your work this week is contributing to the quality of that debate going forward, for which I thank you. We will grow our economy and create jobs by increasing U.S. exports and by staying competitive, not by restricting imports. Ditto the importance of market opening for generating global economic growth and development and the alleviation of poverty. So once again, let me thank you for helping us, better understand how trade policy impacts the global economy at the macro level, at the micro level. Thank you for helping us negotiate better trade agreements. And thank you for helping us to explain those agreements and articulate the benefits of those agreements to interested citizens and to members of Congress as we go forward. We very much appreciate your understanding of how trade policy impacts the global economy and how you are able to share that with us. And we look forward to working with you going forward in a partnership. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. Congratulations again to the Woodrow Wilson International